Here we have sugar maple, Acer saccharum. This is a pretty common species of the northeastern United States and kind of Great Lakes regions. It's found in a broad range of habitats, not really found on the dry mountaintop soils, not really found on the wet bottom soils, but pretty much everywhere in between. It is a mature forest species, so it'll germinate pretty well in deep shade, or moderately deep shade, and it will grow pretty well in the shade. So it's one of those species, kind of like American beech, like black gum, that because it does well in shade, and because it germinates well in forest conditions, it's the kind of thing that if there's no disturbance for quite a while, you're going to start to get more and more and more sugar maples in your woods. They are a little easy to identify. There's a lot of variation in both sugar maple and in red maple, I've found. But got a bunch of tips to help figure out the identification. So I think the most defining feature of sugar maple is the leaf, that kind of classic Canada flag leaf, where we have these deep lobes that are, pretty rounded, U-shaped sinuses. Because it is a maple, it is opposite. So all of our maples have opposite leaves. This maple here, sugar maple, has simple leaves. So per bud, you can see those tiny little buds in there. For each of those nodes, we have 2 branches coming out of the same node. So that's opposite. And because there is a bud right there in the axil of the leaf, then we know this is simple because there's just one leaf and there's not multiple leaflets. So we have that Canada flag. The thing that I confuse it with the most, now red maple has generally less blocky sinuses, kind of sharper sinuses, and more of a serrated edge than these kind of rounded, smooth edges. But our Norway maple, which is not native to the eastern US, can look a lot like this. But if you take one of these leaves and pluck it off, if you have a Norway maple, there will be this milky, kind of latexy sort of sap that accumulates there, and it doesn't here. So we have our sugar maple. And the Norway maple is actually a lot wider than it is tall. Well, not a lot wider, but it's almost like rounded. It's very, very wide and squat. Whereas this is, again, it has those delicate lobes, the Canadian flag. For the fruits, we have samaras, just like with all the other maples, but they are arrayed in a pretty distinctive way. They're almost parallel to each other, so pretty easy to identify there. Whereas our red maples will be held at more of an angle, and actually the Norway maple, which is kind of easiest to confuse with the leaves, again, of the sugar maple, that is actually held out almost flat. They kind of have more of like a clothes hanger sort of look than this sort of parallel. Interesting, we can see here some critter has been eating these seeds. So we can skip right ahead to the sort of ecology here. A nice species for wildlife, it's not like our oaks and things like that. That's kind of like a, cornerstone of the diets of a bunch of species, but a lot of squirrels, a lot of rodents will eat the seeds. Also, they'll eat the buds, important source of browse for deer, things like that, but also squirrels to eat the buds. They will flower early in the spring, kind of right when the leaves are flushing, like a lot of our other maples. So that's an early source of nectar. They are, mostly wind pollinated, but they're providing a little bit for our local pollinators too. And while we're on the note of the uses for wildlife, for humans, really useful tree. Obviously, sugar maple, this is where a lot of the maple syrup comes from, has really high concentration of sugar in the sap, and so it's a lot more efficient to make syrup out of sugar maple sap than out of red maples, silver maples, other maples, although we can boil down other maples, but this has very rich sugar, so really important commercially for that. There are a lot of regions in the US and obviously in Canada where that is a main economic output, is just sap. Sugar, syrup, rather. Also, it's a really important tree commercially, very valuable commercially. Another word for it is hard maple because it has pretty hard wood. And so oftentimes trees will have a lot of rot in them when they get bigger. And sugar maple is one that is pretty prone to that. But if you can get really good lumber out of it, it's used for furniture, a lot of tools, things like that. It's an important commercial species for the lumber value. Quickly, back to the identification. One last thing. I love to talk about bark. I think the sugar maple bark is pretty distinctive. This is one of the first things that kind of pops out to me other than the leaves. So again, there's a ton of variation in maples. A lot of sugar maples and a lot of red maples will kind of look different. And of course, a lot of species will look different at various ages. Sugar maple, this is kind of what a mature sugar maple will look like, where when it's younger, it has these vertical ridges and furrows in the bark, and as it gets older and older, we kind of end up with these like sheets, these like big plates. Like this is now a ridge, this entire thing. And we have these furrows here, but these ridges are super, super hard. So you can just push on them all day and they don't break. They're really thick and they're hard. If this is a red maple, if I just barely pushed, that would crack right over. And also red maple doesn't form these kind of giant, you know, sheets like that. These giant plates of the ridges. It'll kind of be more narrow and again, more flaky. So that bark is pretty distinctive. Generally pretty gray in color. And again, you know, the younger ones will be less dramatic forms of this. And, you know, top or up towards the top of the tree where the trunk is younger, it'll be a lot smoother. But here you have it, sugar maple, super important species, really lovely. Obviously also a very high ornamental value for this species because of the really spectacular autumn foliage. But just a great tree all around, one that people like, critters like, really good to see in the woods, and a really wonderful member of our sort of northeastern forests.